About 6 months into my journey at Heroku, I had a real epiphany. And frankly, it's something that stayed with me ever since then. Because I was like, I'm going to work every day. I'm like, what the hell's going on here? Some things are great, some things are weird. I'm like, why is the weird stuff weird? And I was like, oh, people don't trust each other.
Mm,
And ever since then, my core barometer of company culture has been trust.
yeah.
And I'll name names. So one of the look, trust is hard to build, and the onus should always be on those with power to demonstrate it. Um, but one of the things that we changed at Heroku was, and it took a long time, but explicitly getting to the place of being a high trust culture, being a trust first culture, where the default had been, and I see this all the time, of uh, my default position is I don't trust you versus the default case having to be I trust you. And I'm going to give specifics. This is my tell.
Yeah.
You ready? Once I got to enough, I built up enough credibility at Heroku. One of the things that I did was remove anonymous questions from all hands. And I remember when I went to work with, again, I was a consultant advisor, not an employee, but when I went to GitHub, it's one of the first things I told Matt was like, get rid of anonymous questions if you can. It's hard to do, because what is anonymous questions
Mm,
in all hands? Anonymous questions is an encoded low trust behavior, right? It says, we are going to allow anonymous questions because we agree that if you ask a question with your name attached to it, there can be repercussions such that you'll suffer some negative consequence of that. Therefore, we are going to codify this low trust behavior. We're going to normalize low trust behavior. And that's one of a million examples. Now, of course, you have to have mechanisms for anonymous reporting, for HR, for things like that. I'm not saying you don't have any kind of anonymous reporting structures. I'm saying at all hands, what are you really doing by enabling a anonymous Q&A? You're saying that, people are right to fear retribution. Now, if people feel that way, there's something pretty fucking wrong. So, you got to address that. Don't allow it, fix it. So it's one of the key things I look for, and you see it all the time. And creating a high trust culture and wanting to create a high trust culture. One of the real erosions that we've had in cultures in the past couple of years is, again, I think facilitating, canonizing low trust behaviors. And all of that just reverts back to that you're back to individual mode, you're back to inward facing mode. It's all about me. I'm not part of a team. I'm not collaborating. Nobody's ever had a good time in a company like that.
yeah. Any tips or advice you have for companies they realize that they maybe in a low trust culture, but they want to shift genuinely to a higher trust culture? Like what things that they can do? You obviously mentioned building trust to eliminate
I feel like
anonymous
I'm
all hands.
talking more about companies that are, I don't know what companies we're talking about kind of stage. I feel like I'm kind of talking about maybe a little bit later stage now, maybe 100 employees, something like that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I
that's
want
fine.
to be helpful to your audience. So this is definitely a little bit later stage stuff. But one of the things I tell CEOs is communicating to the company, and this is something I learned from one of many things I learned from Mark Benioff at Salesforce. Communicating to your employees can feel like attacks. It can feel like something
Mm,
that you're doing that isn't part of your job, that is kind of like the busy work or the somehow kind of wasting time here, when in fact it's probably the most important job. And if you're spending 30% of your time on communicating to employees, great, fantastic. And again, another thing I learned from Salesforce, like half the reason, and I can say all kinds of great and negative things about Salesforce, is great, as thankful as I am for my experience there. But one of the reasons why Salesforce has Dreamforce is to communicate back to its own employees when it got really, really big, right? So that shows like how much energy you're willing to put into this thing. So, what's at the foundation of trust? It's communication. So that's certainly, I don't know, that's at least one piece of context.
Yeah, I've heard that and this has been a big belief of mine, that the root of almost all problems is communication, either under communication, lack of communication, or miscommunication. And that leads to the lack of trust. And I like that example of Dreamforce and Salesforce, and a lot of that big purpose of that is for the internal communication. I think is what I found over time with growing branch from, the very early days, everyone has high trust. Everyone is in one room and knows all the information. Once we got above 20, 30 people, we needed to be recommunicating things over time. And by the time we got to 500, it was, you need to communicate the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, 100 times, 1,000 times, because people will hear it differently. You've got new people all the time. You just need to reinforce those things.
As one of my favorite quotes, stolen from one of my favorite PR people, Bruce Francis, repetition is the soul of modernity. And I remember actually having this conversation with an earlier GitHub CEO. You got to repeat things until like your mouth is dry from saying it. Like, you're like, literally, how could nobody have heard this before? You are like a heritage band playing Freebird. Like, your job is to get up there and do the same thing again and again and again and again and again and again. And you have to embrace. Look at how the world works. Look at advertising, right? It's repetition. So there's a reason why that's the case. So yes, embracing repetition rather than being like, look, I got frustrated all the time. People are like, I don't get it. I'm like, we've only had 17 meetings about it, but like you got it. Then you got to try harder and keep doing it.
I know that feeling. It's a good way to consider it. I think a lot of people, myself included at times, have viewed it as a tax.
Yeah.
Instead of viewing it as your core responsibility as a leader,
Yes.
as a founder, whatever your role is. I think that's really important. That the increasing trust through communication. And I really like the example of, you don't want to do things that signal or confirm that there's low trust, such as allowing anonymous questions.
Yes.
But rather do things that indicate that you trust people.
My life goal is to kill the anonymous all hands question.
I'm with you. I remember when I was setting up Zoom webinar for our